In December 2015, various news outlets around the world reported on a strange story which exposed one of the more bizarre elements of the queer umbrella to an unsuspecting public. The tale was of a 52-year-old man who left his family and whole way of life behind to live as a 6-year-old girl, claiming to have been adopted by a couple not much older than himself. This little girl, known as Stefonknee Walsh, received sympathetic coverage in the media, describing family abandonment and a lifetime of hardship, with the stranger aspects of Stefonknee's lifestyle being glossed over or even outright ignored. The exposure helped Stefonknee become an internationally recognised transgender activist, with few in the sphere questioning their motives, while the rest of the world looked on in confused horror. So how did an unabashed fetishist become a representative for trans people? Who was this adoptive family? And was there more to the story of a hulking 6'2" mechanic who claimed to be a 6-year-old girl than meets the eye? Stefonknee, or Stephanie, or Paul Andrew Walsh, was born in 1963 in Scarborough, Ontario. He grew up on a farm with 3 brothers and a sister, doing what he called alpha male stuff, such as clearing barns and chasing cows. Stefonknee says he first became aware he was different after seeing a report on the Stonewall riots when he was just 6 years old, and not long afterwards discovered there were differences between boys and girls, despite having a sister and a mother. He claims to have started cross-dressing when stealing his sister's dresses at a young age, which carried on into his teenage years when he started dating Maria de Mambro, who would go on to become his wife. Maria soon learned of Stefonknee's cross-dressing and was apparently supportive, buying him underwear, dresses and skirts. He says this is what made him fall in love with her, describing himself as a male lesbian. Maria would help cover up Stefonknee's cross-dressing, which would be known as Stephanie time. Stefonknee described one such episode of Stephanie time at his family's farm, when he was cross-dressing upstairs whilst the rest of the family dealt with escaped cattle. Maria would tell the family he was in the bathroom, when in reality he was sitting in his room wearing a dress. Walsh would go on to have 7 children with Maria, and became an auto mechanic, as well as an apparently highly respected pillar of the community, attending church and even building the family home. The cross-dressing continued during the children's upbringing, along with attending various cross-dresser meetings, including one called Gender Journeys in Toronto. Eventually, however, Walsh decided he needed to be more open about himself, and would go on to come out as transgender to all his children in 2007, believing it's best to tell them when they are young. The children found Walsh's coming out to be difficult. In letters they wrote to their father, they detailed their embarrassment of the situation, which Stefonknee read out in a documentary years later.
Dear Dad,
I feel it is very embarrassing to see you walk around like that.
And I hate how you always make jokes about being a girl. It makes me feel weird around you.
Seriously? I'm not crazy about the fact that you wish you were a girl. Every time I see you, I think you're about to walk upstairs and change into something girly or say something girly.
I get a little grossed out every time I see you wearing something girly.
I feel kind of weird that you wear dresses.
By 2009, Stefonknee's marriage would hit a block, with Maria allegedly giving him an ultimatum: the family or the cross-dressing. He chose cross-dressing, and as a result, he says he was removed from the family home. Maria would then commence divorce proceedings against him, and eventually he was disowned by his whole family, and wasn't present when his father passed away. Stefonknee paints a picture of an uncaring family, being cast aside simply for the crime of being trans. It's unsurprising then that his family claims there's another side to the story. Shortly after the split, a restraining order was filed against Stefonknee after being charged with 14 criminal offences of assault, uttering threats, criminal harassment, and criminal mischief. The restraining order was put in place for 2 years. Nicole Walsh, Stefonknee's daughter, who was 13 at the time her father left, said in a Facebook post that he was a really good dad before she became aware of his alter ego, taking her to school and giving her at least 4 hugs a day. Things changed, however, when Walsh came out as Stefonknee. She explained, "Once you told us you're different, it was like you thought you didn't have to be a parent. We didn't ask for a father, just a parent, and you couldn't be that anymore. There were days that if I didn't want to paint your nails, you threatened to stop helping me with homework. I was 13 when you left, and you say you couldn't handle the fact we'd filed a restraining order. People need to know you can't get a restraining order for being of a different mindset. You were a physical threat to Mom, and the day you left, more than one of your children thought you were going to come back and harm us. With this in mind, it was still I and 2 other children of yours who reached out to you on Father's Day, where I genuinely wanted to get closer to you. You took it as mockery, and you told me you didn't want me in your life and told me to go to hell. So thank you for continuing to make us out to be horrible people." In a post on Kiwi Farms as the youngest daughter, she later clarified Walsh made a threat towards her mother, which is the reason for the restraining order. Gender Trender, a radical feminist WordPress site which has since been taken down, discussed Stefonknee being uninvited from the wedding of his eldest daughter. She allegedly sent him a text message asking him not to start a commotion, only for him to send a text message on the day of the wedding, threatening to take his own life. Threats of suicide would become a recurring allegation against Stefonknee whenever he didn't get his own way. Stefonknee would later respond to the Gender Trender article, where he would blame his wife for the deterioration of the marriage, claiming she manipulated the children into turning against him, and also mentioned Maria brought a lesbian lover into the family's life, saying she quickly pushed me out under the lie that my gender identity is a sin. On his Facebook profile page, Stefonknee would also discuss an incident in 2014 where he attempted to pick up his mechanic tools from Maria, only for her to tell him he'd collected it years ago. He accused her of being a compulsive liar, and that she had been making plans to leave him for a number of years, before giving him the ultimatum. He also accuses her of stealing school equipment, such as televisions, camcorders, and D&D players. In regards to his father, Stefonknee tweeted disappointment at not being present at his deathbed, but in a Facebook post a year later, openly mocked him, saying, "Thank God he's dead and buried and gone to a place where evil people can find forgiveness, love and tolerance that they could never express or show to others while they were alive. Luckily, he doesn't have to see his birthday associated with his son's femme Steffi name. Thank you for all the happy thoughts and well wishes. I've wrapped them in pretty pink princess paper and forwarded them to my dad so he can twirl in his new birthday dress in heaven as he shares my trans name for one day each year. I hope and pray that my deceased mother enjoys seeing Dad sissified as much as I do. God rest their souls." The responses to the post were overwhelmingly supportive of Stefonknee's message, with one friend saying the post was really funny, and another calling him the best neighbour ever. Stefonknee hasn't reconciled with his family to this day, but it wouldn't take long to find a new family, one who would allow Stefonknee to become who he always wanted to be. Following the divorce, Stefonknee moved to Toronto, where he started living most of the time as a woman. However, during this period, Stefonknee would still use his male name, Paul, at times. Stefonknee became involved in trans activism, and in 2011, he even led Toronto's Trans March. For a time, he acted as the trans consultant for the 519 Community Centre, but was eventually let go. In a post discussing Stefonknee years later, a Reddit user discussed their experiences, saying, "She has demonstrated herself as a deeply narcissistic and self-absorbed, putting her own struggles as a white trans woman ahead of the struggles of trans women of colour in Ontario, and putting her own attempts at suicide in front of murdered black and brown trans women at TDOR gatherings. This would otherwise seem like a quibbling over her character. When she was employed, however, as a trans consultant for a queer-focused community centre, and aside to work alongside a few trans women of colour, she had a tendency to hijack clients' community presentations and redirect these back towards herself, implying she was the most oppressed trans person there was. Eventually, this cost Stefonknee her job." With few assets to his name, Stefonknee spent time in hospital psych wards due to suicide attempts and dealt with bouts of homelessness, before moving into a homeless shelter, sharing a room with a group of women. It was around this time Stefonknee started age playing, meaning for a grown adult to pretend to be a small child, sometimes as a way to forget responsibilities, but also as a sexual fetish. The women who shared Stefonknee's room would ask to play with his collection of dolls, but he refused to share his favourite, Franny, who he said was his only confidant. Stefonknee spent 2 years in a women's shelter before being offered an apartment in exchange for maintenance work. Stefonknee then went on to join a local church, who provided support during his repeated suicide attempts. And after one particular attempt, on the date of his daughter's wedding, the church decided to make a specific support group just for him. As a result of this, Stefonknee stopped taking hormones, effectively ending his transition. With his life getting back on track, Stefonknee started dating, setting up a profile on FetLife, a social network for the fetish community. Stefonknee's profile, and in particular an avatar of a young girl asking for a fucking pony, caught the attention of one particular FetLife user, a grandfather from Peterborough, Ontario in his late 60s, going by the name Drachenmeister. Drachen, who was in a polyamorous relationship with a grandmother under the name of Suri Darkangel, found himself attracted to what he saw as a great sense of humour on Stefonknee's part, but he said he also had a thing for transsexuals. In his own words, he finds the masculine body with a feminine mind a very appealing mix. After exchanging several messages, they decided to meet in downtown Toronto, where the attraction was instant. They had lunch in an Irish bar, where they teased one another and flirted with the waitress, before they headed to a nearby swingers club, where they had sex. In a podcast entitled How to Become a Princess, Stefonknee describes the experience.
He took my virginity, and it didn't hurt. It felt beautiful. I felt like a woman. And I'm surprised. I didn't think I was going to be pregnant. I was so much a girl, and I actually have an erection right now from it. So I'm just going to pull my dress down a little bit.
Following the date, Stefonknee called Suri to discuss the date with Drachen, where they found they got along surprisingly well. Drachen then arranged for Stefonknee to travel to Peterborough to meet with Suri, where they shared several kisses. Stefonknee soon became ingrained in the relationship, becoming the couple's submissive. Drachen and Suri gave Stefonknee his own princess room, complete with pink curtains, cuddly toys, frilly dresses, and a contractor's ladder. While spending time in the room, Stefonknee would forget he was actually a middle-aged man and would believe he was actually a little girl. Drachen and Suri would encourage Stefonknee to play all the time, and the age play would become a big part of the dynamic of the relationship. Stefonknee's connection with Suri would be more nurturing, whereas with Drachen it would be more sexual. Drachen and Suri's children and grandchildren would also be involved in this relationship, with Stefonknee acting as the younger sister of Drachen and Suri's youngest grandchild. Stefonknee would refer to Suri and Drachen as mommy and daddy, with him describing his role in the relationship as being a little girl or big girl, or a little boy or big boy. Stefonknee would refer to Drachen and Suri as his adoptive parents, and it's this line which got them noticed by the world.
Tuesday on iChannel.
Stephanie Walsh is giving up.
Stefonknee would star in a number of documentaries purely focused on his life. The themes of each would be the same. Stefonknee would discuss his early years, being disconnected from his family, and numerous suicide attempts. One such documentary, Paul Wears Dresses, also shows some of Stefonknee's day-to-day life, including interactions with his church group. Another, Living Two Lives, Dying 1,000 Deaths, is a half-hour monologue from Stefonknee with a heavy emphasis on how difficult his life is. Stefonknee also starred in a lesbian kink podcast entitled How to Become a Princess, which, along with the suicide attempts, also went into great deal with Stefonknee's BDSM relationship with Drachen and Suri, as well as a strange comment on taking down 3-year-olds.
I can officially say I'm the world's biggest flower girl. I don't if a bigger flower girl comes along, I'll take her around. I can take her down. I've taken down so many flower girls. These little 3-year-olds come up to me, say, "You're not a flower girl." I said, "Don't push it, kid. I can so take you on. I'm 6.
Stefonknee's story was eventually covered by Extra, a Canadian LGBT news site, in which Stefonknee proudly announced he was now living as a little girl, and that Drachen and Suri were his adoptive parents. The story quickly spread and was covered by a multitude of news outlets around the world. Most of the reporting in the mainstream press was surprisingly sympathetic to Stefonknee's situation, with little questioning the bizarreness of what was going on. The BDSM element to Stefonknee's relationship was often overlooked, as though the reports were uncomfortable with writing about an openly fetishistic individual. And the gay press in particular didn't question the narrative of how a grown adult male can say they are a 6-year-old girl and still somehow believe this is a positive look for trans people. Outside the mainstream, however, Stefonknee was subjected to ridicule as people had a hard time accepting a 6'2" male as a 6-year-old girl.
Paedophiles and perverts are already abusing these new rules. Would you feel comfortable knowing that this guy could walk into the same public bathroom as your 8-year-old daughter? Oh, and he also identifies as a 6-year-old girl, by the way. Would you feel comfortable with him hanging around the playground?
Stefonknee would later say he received death threats as a result of the negative backlash, but this newfound attention also gave Stefonknee a platform to take his own brand of trans activism to a strange new level.
Why, hello! Welcome to Stephanie's Playtime. I hope my little sockets have been good. We have an adventure for you. Come on in and see what we found.
On December 12, 2015, Stefonknee uploaded a video to his YouTube channel called Stefonknee's Playtime, Play Therapy. In the video, Stefonknee discusses the hate he's experienced since the grown man pretending to be a 6-year-old girl stories broke into the mainstream, and thanks people for wanting to learn more about transphobia. Stefonknee then starts promoting sockettes, an elasticated lace accessory for people to wear around their ankles to show their support for Stefonknee and others in the trans community. It's not clear exactly how this offers support to trans people, as no charities are ever mentioned. Stefonknee repeatedly talks over a cat during the video, who likely has more important things to say than he does. The video ends with Stefonknee assuring the audience he poses no threat to children, despite identifying as a 6-year-old girl. The next, called Stefonknee is a Shiro, sees Stefonknee rescuing a Hello Kitty inflatable after it is apparently kidnapped by Linda B. Shenko. Stefonknee steals the inflatable outside of someone's house before plugging it in elsewhere and declaring himself a Shiro. The third, entitled I Just Gotta Pee, sees Stefonknee awkwardly hanging out with a teddy bear called Strawberry in a burger joint called Fresh Burger, complete with a product plug. Stefonknee needs to go to the bathroom, but cannot decide on whether to use the men's or women's restrooms. Quickly giving up, he pulls down his underwear and pretends to urinate into a bucket. It's unclear whether this is supposed to be a statement on trans bathrooms, as Strawberry comments on how the restrooms are called washrooms and not bathrooms. The fourth video, Pay It Forward, strikes a different tone compared to the others, showing Stefonknee helping give out clothes to homeless people in Toronto along with his church group. Stefonknee is barely featured in this video, although it opens with screenshots of critical tweets he has received. Stefonknee's final video, entitled Schnitzel Queen Ach No Bier, sees Stefonknee donning a dirndl and ordering a schnitzel with Strawberry. The staff at the restaurant refuse to serve him alcohol as he is only a 6-year-old girl, although they give him candy instead. Whilst the first few videos had upwards of 30,000 views, the Schnitzel Queen video would prove to be the least popular of the series. By this point, the internet's fascination with Stefonknee had passed. Trolls, who had once bombarded him with mocking messages, had moved on. Stefonknee's 15 minutes of fame were officially over. Shortly after, Stefonknee was reported missing, but later found, and had many assuming this was one final grasp for attention. Now that Stefonknee's time as an internationally known trans activist has come to an end, let's examine exactly what made him so controversial, and I think it can be summed up in one word: attention. Comments made by Stefonknee's family and those who knew him when he first moved to Toronto paint a picture of someone who needs to be at the centre of every conversation. An example of this can be found in Paul Wears Dresses. In one scene towards the end, Stefonknee discusses his daughter reaching out on Father's Day, and when his church group tries to show sympathy with the daughter, Stefonknee reads out the response he sent.
Please text me if you want to, but I'm not ready for a call. Happy Father's Day. And I respond with, I'm going to kill myself.
These are children who are traumatized. We're there to protect our kids, Steph.
Mm-hmm. No, so, you're there to protect your kids. I haven't seen my kids in 5 years.
But
I can't protect them.
That this clip even made it into the documentary, despite how clearly awful it makes Stefonknee look, highlights his self-centered nature, seeing the message of a suicide attempt to his daughter to be the more important event rather than the daughter reaching out after years of separation. Of course, we can never know the true extent of Stefonknee's personal life outside a few comments made by members of the family, the disturbing messages about his ex-wife and deceased father, and repeated threats of suicide. But Stefonknee's clear need for attention is made most clear in his very public desire to be seen as a 6-year-old girl, and the advertising of a fetishistic lifestyle that seems unusual even in the kink scene. And Stefonknee's own name, a portmanteau of Stefonknee, is a reference to his own submissiveness within a BDSM relationship. To clarify, this isn't a judgment on people who have their own fetishes, and I'm certainly not going to condemn consenting people for what they do in their own private lives. But this changes when that lifestyle moves from the bedroom to the streets, being plastered all over the media by conscious choice and effectively lived for all to see. It's one thing to ask for respect as a trans woman, but it's a different thing entirely to ask for respect as a 6'2" adult pretending to be a 6-year-old girl. And it's this bizarre lifestyle, the one which would naturally attract so much attention for its disturbing nature, that Stefonknee chose to get his name known to the world. It's almost like previous attempts at more normal attention seeking in his various documentaries likely didn't garner as much notice as he'd liked, and he got to play his fetish to the world, effectively including everyone in his sexual fantasy. But it's also important to highlight how Stefonknee's transition seemingly ended after his church group dedicated a whole support group just for him. This is a very strange point to end one's transition, and for me, this is the act that really called into question Stefonknee's sincerity as a trans woman. Having attention from friends isn't a replacement for hormone therapy, and I cannot think of a single transsexual who would agree Stefonknee's actions were those of a legitimate trans person. But with the trans umbrella open enough to include cross-dressers and fantasists, the community does allow people like Stefonknee to take the label of trans and twist it to protect them from criticism. To condemn Stefonknee's fantasy would be transphobic in their eyes, as a grown man wanting to be a toddler is to be seen as equal to a trans woman who has made all the changes needed for a society to generally see and in some cases even accept her as a woman. Stefonknee's private Stephanie time, acting as a parody once coming out, stopping hormones once he gets his way with his church, an openly fetishistic lifestyle which branches out into all he does, frankly does a disservice to give him the same level of respect as the many trans men and women who have done all they can to be taken seriously as their new gender. Stefonknee's attempts at becoming an activist could have and should have been ignored. Unfortunately, sympathetic coverage from the mainstream media and a lack of distancing from bigger name trans activists because anyone and their dog can be trans allowed Stefonknee to be seen as a credible advocate for the trans community by those with limited understanding of trans issues, or those looking for a scapegoat to generalise legitimate trans people as delusional creeps. Whilst on a smaller scale, Stefonknee's treatment as a trans advocate bears some similarities with Jessica Yaniv, who I discussed in a previous video. People with clear fetishes abusing tolerance of a group of people in order to achieve fame and notoriety, coming to represent a group of people who often have little in common with them. And the activists who make their livelihoods of trans issues refuse to challenge their behaviours, which in turn allows for more abusive people to claim the mantle of being a trans advocate. Stefonknee serves as a warning to what trans activism might become when dishonest attention seekers try to make the most of the goodwill generated by reasonable trans men and women within society. And with the Yaniv saga playing out at the time of recording, we're living in the clown world generated by unchallenged individuals speaking for us all. But Stefonknee will be most remembered for how a clear fetishist can take advantage of the trans label in order to play their fantasy to the world.